Good evening. Well, it's good evening here. I don't know where it is wherever you are. I promised a word or two on Yemen, and I have been thoroughly briefed on this by our interns at the Next Century Foundation, who've been very helpful in putting a few thoughts on paper. So let me just share an idea or two with you in regard to Yemen, a place which is absolutely miserable. I mean, it's facing awesome levels of cholera, starvation, dehydration. And then you have the endless violence. People wake up to violence. Political deadlock goes on, and we need to see it broken. I mean, there has been a ceasefire. Thank God there has been a ceasefire, but that's only around the port of Hodeidah. In order to break the deadlock, the people involved, the great powers, particularly Britain and America, who can put pressure on the participants, must get a greater sense of urgency and understand the needs of their adversaries. I'm talking now in terms of the Houthis. I mean, both sides, actually. The Houthis need to understand the needs of the Saudis and their clients, and the Saudis, the British, the Americans must understand what the Houthis need. We need a win-win situation. We need a solution to this terrible issue if things are to progress in any even remotely constructive way. And progress it must. You've all seen Lise Doucette's horrible reports. Well, I didn't say horrible reports, but I mean heart-rending reports from Yemen. How can civilization? I mean, I went to Iraq when sanctions were at its worst, and I watched babies dying in hospital, but not with. I mean, they may have had dysentery and so on, but not this kind of level. Not this kind of level of horror. And it's horror. And this war has gone since 2014. It's been raging in Yemen. We have they started with mass protests as part of the Arab Spring in 2011. That's where the genesis of everything, which forced the incompetent, and some would argue extremely corrupt, long-standing President Saleh to concede power to his deputy Hadi. But Hadi had a weak government, incapable of dealing with a struggling economy. Now, I'm deeply indebted to the interns who put together some thoughts on this. But the point is that the government of Yemen became massively unpopular. Democratically elected? Barely. But it became massively unpopular. And there were the Houthi group, kind of religious reformists, not exactly Shiite as you would, I mean, you wouldn't think of them as Shiite, really. They're more like a Sunni faction, but they've got Shiite flavor to some of their approach. They seized control of a large proportion of northern Yemen up by the border. They had squabbles for years with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, had taken much of the furthest north portion of Yemen and absorbed it into Saudi Arabia years ago. And in theory, it should surrender it, but it never will. And it's been building a border wall. Houthis got on by smuggling. People up there in North Yemen were great smugglers. Well, Saudis build walls to stop all this. And, of course, they like control. Well, we all like control. I like to control things, but there are limits, you know. And the Houthis took umbrage because the walls and so on added to the oppression of or at least the economic oppression of the Houthis in the north. So they, anyway, as Saleh's deputy Hadi became increasingly incapable of dealing with things and became more and more unpopular, so the Houthis took control and seized the capital, Sana'a. And of course the Saudis then, backed by Britain massively and the United States, most weapons actually in this instance coming from Britain, they backed the crushing of the uprising, and they backed the very unpopular Hadi government. So the US, UK, and France all back this extremely unpopular government. In fact, a government that is really not a government in name only, because nobody respects it. This Iranian claim that it supports the Houthis, it doesn't. How can it support the Houthis? Yeah, there are some rockets that they got there in the early days, but and they've been used to horrendous effect because as terror weapons by the Houthis against the Saudis, very, very ruthlessly, just flinging them across. Of course, it deeply and profoundly concerns the Saudis and their allies, the Emiratis. Most of the troops that die there, Arab troops that is, are Emiratis, not Saudis, but the Emiratis have thrown themselves into this action. The Emiratis, of course, have a great concern about Iran, and small wonder. I mean, Iran took the 3 islands, it just snatched them. Emirati resentment of Iran and Iranian meddling in the United Arab Emirates is well founded, and Iran is now perceived as being behind the Houthis. The Houthis, of course, well, they have an office in Najaf, and I suppose they're kind of nominally Shiite, and they stupidly use the same death to Israel, death to America cries that the Iranians do. But basically, they have very little to do with Iran. Anyway, this war over nothing has created the world's worst humanitarian disaster. 60,000 violent deaths, some say. It seems a low figure to me, given the bombing. Certainly, according to the UN Office for Humanitarian Aid, 75% of the population need humanitarian aid. Well, of course they do. I mean, there's a blooming blockade. It's an atrocious situation. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, but it is an atrocious situation, and one that cannot be allowed to continue. So 8.4 million at the risk of starvation, and according to Save the Children, a very good, very worthwhile charity if you're thinking of supporting a charity. They claim that 85,000 children have died thus far of malnutrition in Yemen. Cholera, dehydration plaguing the country, and no access to safe water and sanitation. So we saw peace talks in December, and a ceasefire was agreed around the port city of Hodeidah, and broken, but nonetheless it's a start. So now we need something rather more, and it is up to Britain and America to push that. How else? How else is anything going to move? There is a very good British negotiator involved. I mean, We need a new start for Yemen. What are we going to do about it? What is the answer? Everyone needs to gain something, I guess. The Houthis could break ties with Iran. This might be helpful as their big concession. And maybe to soften that blow for the Iranians, America could ease up on their sanctions approach to everything Iranian. But concessions need to be made by all. Obviously, international pressure with Jamal Khashoggi being killed so ruthlessly by the Saudis. International pressure is there, but it needs to. There is more needed. A real thinking outside the box is needed, and then we can move forward. I mean, the Houthis can support again the fight against Al Qaeda. Obviously, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula occupies or runs most of southeastern Yemen. Amusing seeing the BBC maps. It's a real joke because they put all of southeastern Yemen as controlled by the government. Of course, it isn't. It's controlled by Al Qaeda. And that's not really helpful. Yes, the Houthis too. The Houthis must grow up. They must stop crying death to America at their mosques, death to Israel. I mean, what's Israel got to do with the Houthis? It's just ridiculous. It's just they're copying Iran. But grow up, sit down, negotiate peace. As the children are dying. This devastation really has to end, and it can end. So let's see a better tomorrow. Let's all support the British negotiator, but the governments of Britain and America, particularly Britain, America it's not central focus for America. Particularly Britain. Well, I know I say that America supports the Saudis, but on this, Britain could actually lead a bit more. Britain could do a lot if Britain cared. If the people of Britain cared. Britain's distracted by blooming Brexit. They don't care. But if we cared, then our government could do a lot to promote peace in Yemen and change things for these miserable people. Thank you.